Today I would like to talk about capitalism in right-wing worldview. Capitalism is oftentimes one of those love-or-hate topics in right-wing sphere. You find both haters and fiery proponents of capitalism. This leads to lots of discord and attempts to exclude another point of view and group of people from what we would call a right-wing sphere. But the amount of combination of right-wing and conservative ideas is so big, and those combinations, including some pro or anti-capitalist views, are so numerous that eventually you end up excluding a lot of people. This may lead to doubts whether you made the right decision in excluding them. Just recently I have seen two of my nationalist friends attacking each other and their preferred political parties just because of different views on capitalism and free market. And this is kind of sad to watch, as besides capitalism they are very similar in their values. Was one of them really fake right, as they kept calling each other, or maybe there is something else, some other ways for reconciliation? Is there a possible common ground? I will start with mentioning two main points of criticism against free market capitalism which I have encountered most often. There is two main accusations. The first one sounds roughly like this: capitalism per se brings immorality, cultural decline, and opens path for degeneracy, family destruction, etc. And the second one: capitalism makes society vulnerable against subversion, which we can see with transnational corporations, banks, and other big financial powers attacking society, national interests, pushing for degenerate agenda, socialism, etc. So the first one is more about alleged inherent immorality, while the second one deals more with abuse of capitalist system by certain powers. The first point, in my opinion, is based on wrong assumption, which ironically is very similar to one that some capitalists hold. This is the assumption that capitalism is a self-sufficient full-scale system ready to cover every aspect of life. Capitalism opponents claim that capitalism therefore is immoral system which ruins everything it touches, and some proponents claim that capitalism covers every aspect of life just fine and nothing better exists. The glaring problem I see here in these both cases is that claim of self-sufficiency of capitalism. It's even called capitalist system, when in fact it's very obvious that capitalism is not a system meant to cover everything, in stark contrast with Marxism, by the way, which always strive to be a full-scale system and usually ends up as a totalitarian system when applied. Just think about it. Let's say I call myself a capitalist. What information exactly it gives away about me? Yeah, you can try to guess by using the most common ideological combinations, or trying to guess subculture if there is one, but essentially you will be left wondering who I am, what is my culture, my political views, my religion, my preferred government type, my income, my views on race or ethnicity. Basically, you got nothing. If I tell you, let's say, I make money from rent and consider myself capitalist, what have I told you? Pretty much nothing. You only know my economic activity. I could be monarchist, I could be Buddhist, I could be racist and pro-democracy, I could be national capitalist, I could be pro-dictatorship, I could be misogynist or a family man. Unless you know me already, just informing you that I am capitalist only reveals to you that I do not belong to some known totalitarian systems with different economies. That's it, not much else. This is because for me, capitalism covers a small part of my life, important but small. My life has a large amount of factors outside of capitalism. Could I just tell you something like, well, I'm a software developer or designer and it's my culture? Sounds pretty absurd, right? Because in reality I have a lot more: my family, my traditions, my religion, my community, my friends, relatives, neighbors, like-minded people in the right-wing sphere, customs and habits of my city, customs of my ethnic group, and many more. This is the natural way of life, this is the natural state where a man usually finds himself. This is the situation as it is before any crises have happened. Now, about alleged inherent immorality of capitalism. First of all, immorality wasn't born with capitalism concept. Immoral or dishonorable actions and greed were oftentimes a bane of some feudal and monarchical societies, vassals betraying their oaths, kings backstabbing each other, and even cooperating with enemies of their faith to defeat competitor, aristocracy indulging in greedy degeneracy, spending huge amount of money on luxury. These things are old as the world itself. Generally speaking, we can only discuss the power of other factors that were balancing scenes and societal decline in different times. What we are experiencing now is the lack of balance. All the other factors that were holding fabric of society intact are declining in their strength. The only factors getting stronger, the state and leftist ideologies. Another example, Planned Parenthood and their creepy evil business. Why do you think so many capitalists on the right wing are against Planned Parenthood despite it making money, satisfying some, demand, having some property and services? Because the moral filter or religious filter comes first for everyone who haven't lost his cultural and moral compass. Technical details like Planned Parenthood formally having property and services should never hide actual immorality of their actions. This is the natural default situation or default state when pure economic procedures, processes, and evaluations of the form or the shape of activity do not abolish primary concerns of morality. Selling tissue of butchered babies does not give a free pass just because there is a demand and supply factors in it. And we will not compare Planned Parenthood with a grocery store which conducts business in a totally moral fashion without ever endangering moral foundation of society. However, as time goes and religious influence decreases, people lose their initially sane and sound approach of evaluating things through lens of morality and decency. What is left then, formally capitalistic processes of selling and buying, or the concepts of legality. So after, let's say, 20 years, we might reach the situation when only economic concerns are left, and they are left in cultural vacuum. But as we can see, there is nothing in capitalism itself that dictates this transition to cultural vacuum. Nothing in default capitalism really prevents society from burning down immoral business or expelling it from a city or state. In fact, government and political system has a lot more to do with normalization of degeneracy than purely economic system. There is no capitalistic moral dogma or some sort of enforced belief that would push society towards cultural decline. Only when there is a collapse of those primary filters, which should come before economic filters, only then we start to get some big problems with our society. It's just like in your normal life. If someone asks you for money, there is a bunch of filters or lenses you are using to evaluate this situation, this request. Family lens, if it's your kid or wife. Kinship lens, if it's your relative. Friendship lens, if it's your friends. Compassion lens, if it's someone who is in real troubles. Duty lens, if money is needed for something morally right and important. And then, when all the filters are used and you realize that this is a situation suitable for economic relationships between you and a person who made a request, only then you will start to think in capitalistic terms, offering money in exchange for something. Therefore, if all the primary lenses are working well and you have a proper moral compass, there will be nothing wrong in economic relationships between individuals. But when your worldview gets so screwed up that you are starting to sell bread to your kids, only then usage of economic laws in inappropriate situation will inevitably create something dubious, to say the least. Now, back to the ironic part, where both haters and proponents portray capitalism as a, let's say, full-scale system. Why do haters do this? Well, two reasons. They'd love to undermine what they see as a danger by pointing to areas where capitalism allegedly fails. But they also see those particular capitalists who advocate for what you would call self-sufficiency of capitalism as a foundation of society. But where does the notion of capitalism self-sufficiency derive itself from? And this is the key point here. I personally believe that alleged self-sufficiency of capitalism grew from crises in other spheres of life, from cultural and religious crises. Basically, after everything else is shaking, capitalism remains as the sole way of arranging things in a world, at least for some people, who then try to universalize free market capitalism. Imagine if I have a horrible identity and religious crisis. All my worldview starts to crumble, but as majority of humans do, I start to seek for some shelter, ideological, spiritual, rational, whatever. I need some compensation for what I lost. At some point, I have high chances of finding something that holds my worldview together. It might be some utopian system, and then I will whine that current system is scheisse and we have to rebuild everything, but until we get there I can calm down while waiting for my preferred utopia, or I might start to rebuild my shaking paradigm using something existing and turning it into universal system when particular law or principle is applied everywhere and can easily override other laws. This is how, in my opinion, capitalism got that universalism undertones. Not because it was meant to replace everything else, not because it was capable of replacing everything else, but rather as an answer to cultural vacuum, answer to crumbling traditional institutions and crumbling worldview. Capitalism is not utopian, it describes many things that exist already, and it's not an utopia enforced on people, and it's not like people are unable to understand it. Quite the opposite, it presents something functional. So it's factual, it's real, therefore it appears as a handy shelter to those losing their former ways of life. Now, it is wrong to treat capitalism as a sole viable foundation of society, but what can you do when people desperately search for such illusions to hide misery of the new life in a cultural vacuum? The attempt to universalize laws of free market capitalism is not always a product of sinister subversion. Sometimes it may be a result of a good but misguided intentions. These people may believe that they are coherent, consistent in forcing this type of universalism. This is integrity, they might say. The problem is that when you turn a secondary principle in a universal principle that overrides or overwrites something fundamental and primal like a moral principle, you destroy integrity of culture as a whole. One interesting and rather telling thing to mention here is the increase of social conservatism in libertarianism and anarcho-capitalism. So while Ludwig von Mises, the key figure in Austrian School of Economics, was kind of moderately conservative, Murray Rothbard, who started as anarcho-capitalist, turned into even more socially conservative, up to the point that he actually started to develop so-called paleo-libertarianism together with Al Rockwell. And paleo-libertarianism is famous for being very socially conservative, in stark contrast with what Rothbard called nihilo-libertarianism or left libertarianism. And then they were followed by Hans Hermann Hoppe, who pretty much announced that non-traditional lifestyle in libertarian world gonna be expelled from society. This, I believe, illustrates the fact that those thinkers who were really digging into the societal issues inevitably discovered that you can't really stretch economics to cover every aspect of society. You have to have something to hold the society together, and only then you can safely apply free market, libertarian and capitalist rules. This is why even this line of ardent pro-capitalist philosophers distance themselves from leftist culture, from militant atheism, etc. They understood that social fabric is something that requires a lot of factors to work in accordance, and you can never replace them all with free market capitalism. Not because free market capitalism is horrible by definition, but because it was never meant to replace other, more important staples of society. But when you do try to use it as a replacement, it will create abomination, it will give you all kinds of side effects. And one of the side effects is the current situation, when people who would otherwise be okay with capitalism are appalled and disgusted by the notion of economic system being used in addressing all the important societal issues, which inevitably brings these people closer to socialist-style economies and preferences, which then in turn creates additional disagreements with other factions like national capitalists, conservatives, etc. Now, to the second accusation against free market capitalism. The second claim that capitalism critics are using is following. Capitalism makes society vulnerable against subversion, which we can see with transnational corporations, banks, and other big financial powers attacking society, national interests, pushing for degenerate agenda, socialism, etc. Now, this is also partially stems from universalism of free market capitalism, but has even more to do with political system, which essentially provides cover for anti-national business, even when it goes against healthy capitalistic environment, banks being saved by the state, crony capitalism, exclusive licensing, lobbying, transnational corporations getting away with anti-national activities. For these to exist, someone has to provide cover and protection. Someone has to enforce this unnatural order. This is done by the state, oftentimes using universalism of some liberal dogmas and thus overwriting every other perspective and point of view and denying society and nation right to react in a proper way according to those mentioned primary filters of morality, family values, etc. Hiding behind freedoms and universalist concept of legality, they open the door to hell, figuratively speaking. This being established, let us move to pro-capitalists' claims against some nationalist circles. One of the most common problems that right-wing capitalism proponents have with some other nationalistic right-wingers is the alleged drift of nationalist parties towards socialistic and regulatory practices. Free market capitalists accuse them of being infested by socialist economic paradigm and of their orientation towards redistribution of wealth. Oftentimes this is a valid claim. There is indeed some dubious economic programs among nationalist parties in Europe and nationalist movements in Western world in general. It ranges from being moderately infected by socialist ideas, practices of nationalized healthcare and welfare, up to the point when it pretty much starts to sound like socialism organized for just one particular nation, meaning without diversity and multiculturalism. Why this is happening? Well, one reason is the overall proletarization and infantilization. In this new environment, promises of free stuff inevitably start to infest right-wing sphere as the overall quality of human material decreases and it becomes increasingly difficult to win votes by offering people low taxes, liberty and ability to take care of themselves. On a brighter side, European parties which are using this socialistic redistribution rhetoric are usually more like opportunistic and populist style parties rather than actual economic socialism believers. They throw a bunch of free stuff promises, mix them with nationalism and some traditional values to just try and get more votes from every potentially interested group of voters. Could they achieve the same election results by using some hardcore anti-welfare, ultra-patriarchal, anti-statist rhetoric, offering people some sort of traditional liberty? Not sure. This is a concept that requires certain high-quality human material and resources, and obviously it needs a proper system and environment to produce these people. So the pro-capitalists' claims against nationalist movements are sometimes valid indeed, but they don't always take into account current situation where nationalist parties have to compete against people who are doing pretty much state-level bribery and just buy voters. And then it's also about priorities, whether you have to slightly hurt your economy and bribe some people with nationalist-style free stuff promises, and then maybe you get into government to do something, like limiting immigration, for example, or you try to be purist, but then you risk of being in opposition forever, hoping for a military coup or some big cataclysm. This is not an easy question, as purists may argue that getting in a government with a socialist redistribution program means that you are forever slave of leftist paradigm, as you legitimate it yourself, legitimate morality of redistribution schemes, and then you may still fail to use them in your favor, as you will always fall behind true socialists who will, at the end of the day, beat you in promising free stuff. Now, how to mend these disagreements and divisions? Today the ball is in the capitalism proponents' court. They have to make first steps to restore the proper order of things, to limit universalism of free market capitalism rules. Otherwise, with more and more people on the right being suspicious about capitalism and with leftists actively rooting for socialism, capitalism will be marginalized as an economic system. And unfortunately what will come to replace it will be much worse. Pro-capitalists have to understand another fact, that your abstract, universally applied capitalism is not going to become a flagman of meaningful resistance against the left for one basic reason: nobody is going to sacrifice his life over economics concepts. Have you noticed that every significant protest has something bigger than just economic issues behind it? Take, for example, Yellow Jackets protests. What for some people seemed to be a protest caused by a fuel tax was in fact a protest caused by a perception of justice, or rather injustice, fueled by condescending and hostile attitude from a government led by a guy who is considered as an elitist outsider, who cares about his powerful friends and taxes the hell out of the working class and the middle class, so figuratively speaking, the alienated government spitting into the faces of people. The protest had a lot more to do with the feeling of being humiliated and pushed aside again and again, rather than with the pure losses due to the fuel tax. The anger due to humiliation because of poverty has more to do with humiliation rather than poverty. Protests in Hong Kong were another example where people risked their lives and well-being for what was seen as humiliation and infringement of their rights and autonomy. Alien system trumps their will and freedoms, disrespects them. This is a powerful fuel for protests, as it deals with absolute values. People used to kill for honor or lack of respect. This sits deep in human nature, and this is much more important than money. On the other hand, can you imagine someone creating a group of fighters waging guerrilla warfare against the government just because they are proponents of a flat tax? Can you imagine a guy attacking a government forces and then killing himself with his last words, "for the free trade with China"? Quite unlikely, right? This doesn't happen because, generally speaking, normal, decent people tend to sacrifice their lives or take away other lives only for the absolute values: honor, religion, freedom, independence, national pride, kinship, love, things like this. Capitalism, in order to get violent defenders, needs to be intertwined with some of these concepts, like being able to keep your money and not paying tribute because honor dictates so, or because only slaves get taxed, or because someone disrespects you by putting you in an extreme poverty. Then things gonna explode. But no one is going to die for the concepts that have no clear connection with absolute and oftentimes non-materialistic values. I'm saying all of this here because I had this conversation so many times when talking to, let's say, center-right folks who genuinely believe that you somehow can preserve freedom while only talking about taxes and regulations. But as a famous French anthropologist Gustave Le Bon predicted, in religion as in politics, success always goes to those who believe, never to those who are skeptical. And if at the present day it would seem as if the future belongs to the socialists, in spite of the dangerous absurdity of their dogmas, the reason is that they are now the only party possessing real convictions. The modern governing classes have lost faith in everything. They no longer believe in anything, not even in the possibility of defending themselves against the threatening flood of barbarians by which they are surrounded on all sides. This was correct then, 100 years ago, and it's still something to remember today. If you want to win something as big as cultural war, you have to use adequately important values. Alas, just free market capitalism won't be enough. As for the anti-capitalists and what steps they could make towards the reconciliation, the first and the most important one would be: do not portray capitalism as some sort of Marxism twin brother. It's not a universal system, and you don't really have problems with capitalism itself. You have problems with people who lost all the other societal orientiers and now are clinging to what remains as the last functional system they have in their life. This is quite tragic, actually. Mending this cultural or societal wound takes time, and you are more interested in attracting a lost capitalism universalist to your cause by reintroducing him into fuller paradigm, rather than in bashing actual economic approach and creating dubious situation when you involuntarily strengthen and normalizing socialism. This is, by the way, was a mistake Catholic Church made after a Second Vatican Council, when it started to avoid attacking left liberal ideology and socialism and instead kept whining about consumerism and evil of greed and some abstract unchecked capitalism, while trying to portray every existing problem as a result of improper or unjust economic system, etc. And then what happened? That a lot of Catholic voters just started to vote for the parties who promised to control this evil capitalistic consumerism, and ironically it meant voting for the most atheistic and the most anti-Catholic socialist or left-leaning parties. This is what happens when you fail to name your real enemy or your real problem, or fail to see where is the root of your problem. Someone other will benefit from your mistake or reluctance. So, to summarize and end this video, here is a quick recap. Capitalism is neither a full-scale nor self-sufficient system and should never be treated as such, and free market ideas in isolation are insufficient for any meaningful resistance against socialism or creeping nanny state. Capitalism is sometimes portrayed as a universal system because of crises in other spheres of life, because of cultural vacuum. Let us not confuse influence of capitalism with influence of the so-called liberal democracy, which is directly responsible for protecting and nurturing tendencies which are otherwise easily squashed and repressed by society. Unlike Marxism, which tends to occupy every sphere of life and dictates everything, free market capitalism as a set of basic economic approaches has no problem coexisting with wide array of different views, political preferences, government types, religions, etc. We should be careful not to play into hands of socialism when attacking universalistic free market capitalism. It's much better to create a pipeline that directs people from this pseudo-universal capitalism towards fuller system of beliefs, rather than trying to destroy capitalism itself. There is only one way economic freedoms can survive in the long run, and it's by being an addition to something bigger and to something absolute. It would be a lot easier to protect economic freedoms as part of patriarchal society where free market establishes autonomy of family providers. The priorities should be never confused. Economic approaches are tools, while absolute values like family well-being, religion, national survival, independence are the goals. Therefore, secondary law should never override primary law. That's it. This was quite a long video, but as you can see, it's really difficult to touch this topic without immediate need to clarify things. Leave your opinion on capitalism or anti-capitalism in a comment, hit the like button if you like this video, subscribe to my channel, and by the way, don't forget to subscribe to my BitChute channel as well. It has the same name, as I plan to use it for some risky stuff that is not suitable for YouTube. Follow me on Gab or Twitter, and thanks for watching and have a nice day.